Hi there, I'm Tom Field. I'm Senior Vice President of Editorial with Information Security Media Group. Very pleased to welcome you to our session today where the topic is least privilege as business protection, compliance, coverage, and continuity. I've got a panel of experts with me today led by Kelsey Brazill, Product Marketing Lead with P0 Security. She will be speaking with Greg Danyi, CTO of P0 Security, and Glenn Chisholm, who is an operating partner at SYN Ventures. Now, before I turn this over to them, let me give you some background on our session today. Most teams modernize privileged access because standing an excessive privilege to sensitive systems just creates real business risk. That risk becomes especially clear when teams are asked to prove control and visibility during a SOC 2 audit, a compliance deadline, security incident, or cyber insurance review. In this session, we break down what those moments are truly asking for, why privileged access management is a critical control area, and where legacy PAM tools fall short in modern production environments. You'll see what modern PAM looks like in practice and how to replace standing privilege with just enough, just-in-time access tied to accountable users and detailed session-level evidence. First, let me tell you about Information Security Media Group. We're a global education and intelligence firm, 20 years old this year, based in Princeton, New Jersey. You may know us by any number of our 38 media properties. These include Data Breach Today, Bank Info Security, AItoday.io. In all, we serve an audience of more than 2 million security and technology leaders globally, and we give them a daily diet of news, analysis, research, events, and educational programs exactly like this one. Just a few notes of housekeeping. If you have any questions for our esteemed panel, look, submit them anytime via the chat window on your screen. We may not get to every question today. If we don't get to your question today, we will get you a response via email. Now, should you encounter any technical issues while viewing today's session, I do urge you to take down that email address on your screen, because if you write to webinars@ismg.io, we've got support staff standing by to help you immediately. And just a reminder, today's webinar is copyrighted, meant for today's session and individual study purposes only. If you would like to use any of the information presented today, or if you're looking for customized training materials, do contact us. My delight to introduce our sponsor, P0 Security. P0 Security helps organizations address evolving privileged access requirements by implementing secure, auditable, and agile access to production systems across multi-cloud and hybrid environments. The central platform supports all identity types, including human users, service accounts, workloads, and AI agents. By managing the entire access lifecycle, P0 enables customers to programmatically replace broad access and static credentials with just enough privilege and just-in-time access. Zero standing privileges, zero friction, because threats to your production infrastructure must be priority zero. Quickly, let's meet our speakers. Greg Danyi is the CTO of P0 Security. He's also the co-founder. He leads development of the first unified identity governance and privilege access management platform, purpose-built for the cloud. Kelsey Brazill is a product marketing leader. She has got deep experience launching products and campaigns in the cybersecurity and identity space. She will be our moderator today. And Glenn Chisholm is an operating partner at SYN Ventures. Prior to joining the organization, he co-founded Obsidian Security and served as its chief executive officer, where he helped define the SaaS security market. With that, let me turn you over to Kelsey and team right now. Friends, center stage is all yours.
Thank you so much, Tom. Appreciate the kind introduction, and we're super excited to be here today. It's always a pleasure to get to talk with this community, and really excited to have Glenn and Greg here with me to cover this super important topic. So thank you, Glenn and Greg. And let's jump right in. We're going to have this be as conversational as possible. So please, listeners, just add your questions to the chat as we go, and we'll try and address them as they come in. But to get us started, let's dive into the topic at hand today, which is some of these external pressures that are forcing organizations to think perhaps a bit more urgently about how they're securing their production access today. And Glenn, to start us off, can you give us a sense of why production access or privileged access, depending on who you ask, is an area of focus for auditors and underwriters?
Ultimately speaking, auditors and underwriters are, driven by, a combination of market pressures. So, breaches, problems drive the issues that come to the top of the table for these groups. And obviously an underwriter is sitting there and thinking about the concept of loss, the way that loss is instantiated and the way they see that across their portfolio. So what you're really seeing is you're seeing a proxy for, attacker behaviors, you're seeing a proxy for problems that are then instantiated inside, breaches and other issues that then come to the top of the table. So, what you basically are looking at is sort of this ecosystem that starts out with where is the problem? How does this then rise to the top of the list of issues? So is it sort of fundamental in a breach? Is it fundamental into some sort of loss that the underwriters then have to respond to, and to make sure that their broader portfolio is not at risk for these same types of issues. So ultimately speaking, um, what it means is that these types of issues are the issues that are causing problems that lead to breaches, that lead to loss, that lead to consequential sort of and material issues for enterprises.
And can you give us a little insight about why these systems in particular are bubbling to the surface, as you said? Like what is it about what makes up like these modern production environments that is making it top of mind?
I mean, I think that we've shifted to a system where our our consumer population, the people that consume our services, the people that consume our enterprise business services. And when I mean consumer, I don't just mean the consumer as in the individual buyer. I also mean the enterprise buyer between B2B. We interact with a lot of these sort of structural platforms. So whether I'm a SaaS provider, whether I'm a B2B reseller, whether I'm a B2C reseller, the production environment has become core to everything that allows my business to operate from quote to cash. And so to allow it to exist in that way, what I've had to do is I've had to bring a lot of external access into the environment. So in other words, allow people to be able to connect to the environment, to be able to process things against the environment. That creates external visibility for attackers. It also means that we have, potential sort of weaknesses in the system. Inside that system, identity becomes the key element that mediates the interactions between every element of this environment. And in the environment, of course, to allow that complete sort of transaction to take place, there's huge quantities of data of different types, of different sensitivities, and of different value to attacker groups. So, it doesn't matter whether or not you're being faced by sort of a activist group that's out to make a political point, whether you're being faced by a group that's out to extract, financial gain, or even a nation state attacker that's out to extract, financial gain or IP. These environments become very attractive because of the sheer mass of material within them. And the ability to then move around these environments is dictated by this concept of identity. And identity becomes sort of this key element that allows us to think about it. And so if you're looking at this environment from the outside and trying to judge its overall risk, you have to think about, where the valuable content is, and you have to think about what allows me to move around this environment, to move between these different repositories of value, and identity becomes the key element that allows that to happen.
Thanks for spelling that out. I think it's easy. We're all in the day to day focused on our job and what we want to get done and what makes that easier. And sometimes, like, that normalizes the exceptions that we make, and you can forget what makes some of those same qualities really attractive to bad actors. So appreciate you double clicking there. Greg, what would you add? How can you, based on your experience, I know P0 is SOC 2 compliant. Like, what are our auditors actually asking for? Like, what is what is the proof or the underlying demand that their company coming to companies with?
Yeah, so these frameworks such as SOC 2 and other frameworks also ask you the question to describe your process and tell the story of how you are protecting these valuable repositories in your system. But that's just part of the requirements. The other piece of the requirements, and I think this is where we are going to also focus on later, is to provide hard evidence about it. So here is my story. This is what I do about it. These are my processes, my procedure. And look, this is the evidence that I have implemented this. This is how it happens day to day. This is how I ensure that I keep to my word and the processes that I've set up.
Great.
So yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I mean, I can dive into the detailed requirements.
Yeah, let's save some of that for later.
Yeah.
I would love to stay up high for a minute here and talk about why something that may sound pretty straightforward is actually pretty complex to answer in modern production environments. So open question to both of you, maybe start with Glenn again. How does the more modern multi-cloud or hybrid environment kind of change the audit conversation and make this problem a bit harder to address as things kind of spread out?
Look, we moved from sort of a data center to a cloud environment, and then we moved from cloud to multi-cloud, and we did this for a combination of costs, availability, scalability, elasticity, and as we start to think about sort of these, this movement, each of these steps creates the opportunity to create very, very scalable, very efficient architectures that allow us to deliver that sort of fundamental process that I talked about before, that sort of quote to cash and that delivery process that we think about for our customers. Part of that is we want availability, we want scalability. So as you start to get and you start to be driven by these operational demands, you start to make little decisions that degrade your security as you start to make these decisions. These decisions may be made for a high quality operational reason. The intention may be to come back and resolve that choice. The intention may be that this is a very short-term thing that is done to be able to deal with the scalability issue. We're at Black Friday, we're at a period of significant demand because we're dealing with a change in tariff structures or whatever it happens to be. We make these little decisions, these decisions eke into the environment. And so therefore what we end up with is this complex mesh where there are insecurities that progress in because of a sequence of small decisions that then become bigger and bigger. And that's how we end up with sort of failings on how we're storing, managing, using credentials. And, that allows us to have, our identity become exposed and becomes problematic. And so these multi-cloud environments, it's not that there's anything fundamentally about a multi-cloud environment versus a single cloud environment. It's that complexity and the sophistication of some of these architectures leads us to make sort of some of these issues become more systemic. And once they become systemic, it becomes harder to pull them back out again.
That's a great segue into the topic of non-human identities, I think, in terms of problems that can get away from us quickly. Greg, can you speak a bit to service accounts, CI/CD pipelines, and everyone's favorite topic, agents? How is that adding to the complexity here that Glenn's talking about?
Absolutely. Well, for one thing, I think even within the cloud, as we shift more and more of the workloads to the cloud or multi-cloud, there's also a change going on within the cloud, which is just the explosion of the number of services. The cloud has been around for a while, but if you look, it didn't stop evolving. It went from just providing you instances, VMs, or databases to more abstracted services. And if you look at the list of services in AWS now, it's a very, very long list. Now, to interact with each of these services, you will need some entitlements and some service account in order to access them and interact with them. So because of the services exploded, because now there's a microservice architecture where builders are encouraged and even required to have a dedicated identity for each of their little workloads. And now, the multiplication of the resources and the microservices becomes just so much greater than it was before, and you are dealing with this explosion of service identities.
So with all of that in mind, as teams try and address this, they still have to meet audit requirements. They still have to try their best to gather this hard evidence that you spoke to, Greg. Can you guys talk us through where teams are failing or struggling, and what's tending to lead to that, based on the conversations and your own experiences?
Yeah, so one area that I've seen how this works, in a larger organization is typically when you get to that point in your audit cycle that you need to provide and collect evidence of access provisioning, access requests, and so on. This is a project that gets down delegated to different teams, and those teams then go ahead and may collect their own evidence. So when we talk about production access, that might actually touch multiple different teams and multiple different people in the organization that need to then collect evidence. So one of the challenge that I've seen is definitely how to manage this process effectively, and how to enable these teams to provide this evidence as easily as possible, without them having to figure out what exactly to do, where to go, what is the exact evidence material that's needed.
So it sounds like it's a challenge even when teams are proactively trying to think about this. I guess, Glenn, the same question for you from the other side of this, like when teams fail an audit, or they do have an incident happen, like what are the symptoms that you're seeing or that you would suspect are leading to that in terms of production access controls in particular?
I mean, I think, you see teams fail audits have incidents, but also, you have to remember that, when auditors see failures and incidents in other organizations, they bring those learnings to your organization. They start to ask the questions about you and what you've done, because they themselves have had the negative experience. And so, really what we're looking at here is we get into the process of saying we've put a set of controls in place, and therefore the controls, and we've articulated those controls to the auditor. The problem always comes about when the auditor asks just the wrong question at just the wrong time. And ultimately speaking, then you have to answer that with evidence relating to how that control is actually operated. And that's where you see the failings, because it's not that anyone intended for the control not to be exactly operating as expected. It's that one of those exceptions we talked about early crept in. And when they asked for the evidence piece, well, that's when the exception becomes obvious. And therefore, you now have a failing. And it's not just, oh, this is going to affect me if I have a breach. This is going to affect me if I have a problem. This can come from multiple different directions. If you're dealing with, SOC 2 auditors, you're dealing with, sort of New York DFS or other sort of large scale, compliance groups, obviously this is regulatory compliance, but there's a shared learning experience across these people. It's their job to understand what they don't know and ask questions. And so that's where you end up in this process, which again is just, they happen to ask you the one question that you can't answer.
Right. And I imagine as you start to pull that thread, given what you were saying around how these problems tend to creep and grow, that it can get into a big situation relatively quickly there once they start pulling back.
And having to make production changes to respond to an audit is not where you want to be. Where you want to be doing is you want to be making changes around securing, privileged identities well before you have to think about an audit. So the audit becomes just a natural, the success of the audit becomes a natural benefit from your established and already delivered sort of set of capabilities that you've deployed. And that's the intention, and that should be the goal.
Yeah. Well, with that, let's change gears a little bit to where teams should be trying to get to. And if you could keep going on that thread, Glenn, and talk about like what are the desired outcomes? How can teams kind of rethink their approach to better fit that larger, more complex environment that we started talking about at the top of the webinar?
Look, I think, obviously Greg should jump in here, where necessary. But I think, look, as we think about all the elements of the movement, whether you're moving from a data center to the cloud, whether you're moving, as Greg said, from cloud infrastructure to abstracted cloud services, or you're moving from that to a multi-cloud, or any combination of these things, as you start to deal with it, you start to realize that you have the necessity to use credentials that have degrees of privilege and different degrees of privilege in different ways. And ultimately, static credentials are always going to be a problem no matter where you use them in those sense, because you are reliant upon that there is no issue with those credentials, there is no leakage, there is no problem, there is no parallel storage, there is no other issues. So as you start to think about this concept of least privilege where it's needed, and for the length of time it's needed, it becomes more relevant as you think about this migration, because now we're dealing with a more complex environment. Static credentials become more distributed. That becomes an even bigger problem. That breaks the whole idea of, well, it's just in one place, it isn't that big a deal. Well, actually now it's spread further. As you start to think about that, static credentials become shared accounts. It's not two different things. It can become the same thing over time. And the idea is that the more that you can reduce that window, that allows you to reduce your risk fundamentally across the environment. And that's really what we're trying to do here, is reduce risk, reduce the possibility of a negative outcome if an incident occurs somewhere else in the system. So we're trying to take the attacker's ability to move access data, move laterally, move between environments away by removing the ability for them to exploit credentials that are inadvertently accessible to them.
And I think something we talk a lot about at P0 is, you touched on least privileged and short-lived and like this more ephemeral access, which of course we're big believers in. But I think, as you start to talk about just enough privilege and just in time access, it's easy for, vendors to paint the dream of like, oh, great, you have these capabilities and now you've removed all your standing privilege, which of course it's a much more complex problem than that. And there needs to be like an operational plan around that in order to make it an attainable reality for folks, or, a progression of maturity. And that's what we have outlined here in terms of really making some of these principles part of the broader life cycle of your privileged access, so that you can get to a place where you're remediating standing privilege and also have the tools in place to monitor and make sure that you're constantly discovering where that privilege lives, assessing how you need to address it and prioritize it, and be able to have the ability when the time comes and that underwriter comes knocking at your door to prove what you need to prove.
Look,
Greg, go ahead.
I was going to say perfect can't become, the inhibitor of progress.
Right.
And so, all of these things are about progress towards the correct state. The correct state is not necessarily, the thing you have right now, but it's progress towards that in a continual way that makes you best positioned.
That makes sense. And not the same for everyone, right? That everyone, someone with all the resources is going to have a different end state goal than someone that's trying to do their best with what they've got.
Absolutely. That's the reality of it. This is why, high quality tooling can make all the difference between, the ability to access huge numbers of humans and drive certain behaviors with those humans. If you have the right tooling, you can get the fantastic outcome without access to all those resources.
Greg, can you tell us a little bit about how P0 fits into some of this and what we can do to help alleviate some of these manual processes or pain points around compliance and governance, and also what we're not doing as well, just to paint that picture.
Absolutely. So as Glenn said, you want to create a system where and deploy a system where all of the requirements of your audit and genuine risk mitigation are already built in. So it's not something that you have to scramble when the audit comes to provide the evidence, to provide the description of what has happened. But these things should naturally fall out of the system. So this is where P0 comes in. And as we also mentioned, everybody will be at a different place in their journey, in their process of improving the status quo. So P0 helps by jumping in and meeting you where you are. So you start with assessing and understanding your system, inventorying your service accounts, your static keys, because they are going to be there. And then moving to a system where you can slowly take away these standing privileges, perhaps system by system, or geolocation by geolocation with smaller groups of people, because of course this will affect your ability to, or not affect that. You don't want it to affect your ability to deliver value to your customers, right? So you need to be careful in this journey, not to hinder operations. So you will take a gradual approach and with P0 understand where are the areas where you get the most for your investment, right? Where can you mitigate the most risk, or cause the least interruption? And you can move to a system where you remove these static credentials. You move from a just-in-case setup. The just-in-case setup is that, Greg has admin access just in case he needs to, troubleshoot production, to a real just-in-time and least privileged access, where Greg goes and requests access to the task that he needs to do. And it's not only just in time, but it's also scoped to the task that he needs to do. So it's not really always emergency. It might be just a routine task of like migrating a database or things like that.
Great. Well, I think you have a demo teed up for us, Greg, to look at SOC 2 in particular, and what that looks like with P0. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to you.
Sounds good. So what we are going to go over here is our own SOC 2 audit and some of the controls that we have provided evidence for. And I'm going to show how we use P0 to provide such evidence, and how the deployed process itself, it just falls out. The evidence just falls out of the system. So and with that, let me share my screen. Great. So we use Vanta for managing our SOC 2 requirements, and what you see here is our dashboard where you can see the long list of different controls, and for each control what kind of tests and documents we provided as evidence. So I selected 4 such controls where you can use P0 as a source of evidence. Now, one thing I have not mentioned about P0 yet is that after discovering what are the standing privileges, you can move to a just-in-time privilege model where P0 will manage the access tickets, and upon approval, the automatic provisioning of such access. So the first control we are looking at is that these access controls procedures are established. And here, as Kelsey, you said, we want to establish what P0 does and what P0 does not do. So P0 does not do things like provisioning access to a SaaS platform for all of your employees. We are focused on really the production stack and provisioning access to the production stack. If you come from a perspective of least privilege, then you would want to be at a place where you have minimal standing access. And in that case, the user access provisioning piece of this requirement is really going to boil down to the access tickets and what was the history of each access request ticket and what's the process that you've established and operationalized there. The second control, and I'm going to jump to the second because the evidence is the same, is that there are access requests for each case when somebody touches production. So for both of these, you can go to the P0. And again, I'm going to show our own environment here, to the P0 console, and look at the access request history and provide an export of this as evidence. So here you can see who was the requester, what role or resource they requested, who approved it, and what was really the reason for that. So you can see in our system, again, as I mentioned, not everything is break glass. Maybe I'm recording a webinar. Maybe I'm running end-to-end tests in stage. This is actually not a production access. Maybe I'm looking at our identity center configuration. And you can export them as a simple list, or I think what we've noticed, of course, auditors want is a more detailed rundown of what actually happened. So you have the timestamps of who created, what was done, what was provisioned, and when access was revoked, it was deprovisioned. And let me show other side of this. So what auditors want to see is what are your processes, right? What is the process that's operationalized? And that you can find in the policy studio in P0. These are the rules that describe how access is managed, who can request what, and who needs to approve. One of the common requirements is that access to production requires manager approval. You can use P0 to define such a rule where you can say that whoever is annotated as the manager in your identity provider needs to approve this particular request, and that can apply to the a broad set of people. And it's a very dynamic way of, a very succinct way of saying that there is one rule that expresses a very clear translation from policy to implemented rule. That manager approval required. Hey, here is the rule that it implements that particular requirement. We can look at another control here, which is about production network, right? So production network, if you have a hybrid or an on-prem deployment, or you have resources behind a VPN, you would provide evidence about that. This demo is gonna, of course, look at things that we have at P0. We don't have such a requirement because we are based entirely on the cloud, but we do have our network perimeter on the cloud, sort of. So what you look at your network perimeter is going to be your IAM policies in your production. For us, this is in GCP. And here an example of how easy this can become if you achieve true zero standing access is you can just look at, if I exclude all these service principals and I look at only users, this should hopefully be a relatively empty, it should be an empty page, basically. Hey, no one has production access. If you do, then it will be linked to an access request in P0, which we saw here in the history. So at this point, actually, I could potentially look at how that looks, such an access request. So I can go and request access if I want to do something in production. Since we talked about AI, I'm going to choose an AI role. Let's say maybe I need to export some diagnostic information from my production LLM, which is not something that I have already set up in regular exports. So in this case, I would go in and have to connect to it directly, and you can request access. This is the business justification, or you could link it to a ticket from an external system such as Jira or ServiceNow. And once that's approved, this is going to be automatically approved for me because I'm on call. Hopefully nothing happens in the duration of this recording. Once that's approved and provisions, if I go back here now, you should see how my entitlements changed in the system. If I look at users that have access now I have access, and it's going to expire at this certain time, and this is in the system recorded why I got this access. Another requirement or another control that comes up is the unique network system authentication. So here, this is very spelled out for us in a very concrete way. Hey, everybody must have their own SSH keys. You should not reuse SSH keys to production VMs. I wanted to show how using P0 automatically enforces this. So if you use P0 for production access and you want to request or log into a machine, it just naturally ties into the workflow of the end users, because oftentimes it's the friction that creates the bypasses. People work around compliance requirements because it's a harder way to do than just doing it like the very straightforward way. So we wanted to make sure that it's the straightforward way to do. You request SSH to this node, and I need to log in.
Can you talk a little bit about the fact that you're logging into Okta right now, Greg?
Yeah, so one of the requirements in compliance that I have not covered, because it doesn't come from P0, but you need to have strong identity and strong credentials. So that oftentimes boils down to putting your systems behind some single sign-on provider that ensures globally and uniformly that you have MFA, that you have password recovery policies, that you verify that a human is a human when they log in. If you are able to place your VMs for a very different protocol for SSH behind Okta, then you basically cover that sort of requirement. And that's why in this case, P0 works together with identity providers such as Okta to make sure that even for things like SSH, it is required that you log in and your sessions are tied to your SSO identity. And I just typed the wrong instance name here. So let's try with private node. So here what happens is the policies are evaluated and an access request is sent to the appropriate users. And now I received a notification on Slack. You can basically use different channels, email, and Microsoft Teams to get notified about this. And then when you go into the actual request and you approve it, then now the access is provisioned. So you can imagine this in a way that with your SSO passwords and credentials, you are guarding the front gate of your castle, but with P0, you're also locking each of the individual doors or individual rooms that you have. So if there's a credential leakage, well, there's nothing to do inside your castle because every other door is locked. So with such a request, you are now opening up just one door to one room in your castle, to the private node. And whatever you do here is, I'm going to just show a few commands. This is linked back to your original identity, so you get your own user and your own home folder. And if you want to do sudo, because you didn't ask for that key, you cannot do that. I'm going to quit this. And another thing that's a requirement from audit perspective is to show what people did with their privileged access. And this is where you can use P0 to look at the session recording, which is persisted in a different source. So even if the instance disappears, you still have access to it. And we capture the commands that were actually executed with this access request on the machine.
And because you logged in with Okta, this is stored under your specific user information rather than a shared account, which
exactly, this is my user that nobody can have access to. And just to tie it back in a little bit more concrete way to this particular requirement, I had my own SSH key because those are generated for me uniquely in my folder and protected from other users. And this is, by the way, automatically scanned by the agent that's running, the Vent agent that's running on my computer, and it automatically compares my keys to everybody else's keys. And so as long as you can ensure operationally that it doesn't happen, that people need to share keys with each other, everything will just pass automatically. The final example I wanted to show is the production database access. Because P0 can be used to secure various different systems. I showed you GCP and SSH VMs. My VM was actually hosted on AWS. You can also secure databases such as MySQL or Postgres. So if you need to provide evidence for your database, that again just becomes an export of your access request from P0. And apologies, I'm using a demo environment here because we don't have it in our own stack. So I'm going to just show how to filter these down to if it's about a database, then you can easily export Postgres access. And now when you go to your team, hey, provide me access, who owns Postgres, provide me access to Postgres, they just need to use this because there shouldn't be any other test standing access. Everything is going to be provisioned just in time for the user as they need it.
Well, thank you so much. I think we're pushing right up against time here, so maybe we can just wrap with some closing thoughts from you both around, for folks who have listened in and heard everything that you both talked through and your recommendations. How can they think about getting started? Or, if they have an audit coming up in the next couple of quarters, like what can they do in the next few weeks, months to try and make some improvements here?
Yeah, I think definitely starts with discovering what is there now. You might already have done that exercise. In that case, I would start at picking an area that's really known to be risky. Pick your most important database, your S3 buckets, like secure a system with zero standing privilege and just-in-time provisioning.
Glenn?
I mean, I think you just saw Greg sort of demo 3 different use cases. The reality is those 3 different use cases were all very different sort of, value propositions. Get started. That's what you should do. Is you don't have to do all 3. You don't have to do everything. You can secure your production databases, and you can get rid of credentials that means if one of your users compromised, they can access that production database. You can secure those endpoints, et cetera, et cetera. You can pick one thing and start there and make progress today.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for coming. And for everyone for listening in. I know compliance and audits aren't necessarily the sexiest topic, but we gave you 2 guys with accents to listen to, if nothing else. So hopefully that spiced it up a bit. And if you're interested in learning more about P0, please reach out for a demo or some resources that we have that are just about how you can get started on your own on the site as well. And with that, I will hand it back over to you, Tom. Thank you.
Excellent. Kelsey, thanks so much. Appreciate hearing from you and Greg and Glenn as well. I'll take time to thank our attendees also. We know you took time out of your day to attend this session. We're grateful for that and trust you're walking away with some excellent new insight. As always, I look forward to seeing you at one of our upcoming events. Until then, for Information Security Media Group, I'm Tom Field. Thank you for giving us your time and attention today.